Carole needs no introduction, but I'm going to give her an introduction. I hope you all know Carole from, first of all, her excellent publication on the, two publications on the 30th foot. Her work on Abercrombie, her work on Napoleonic Lives, which I hope you've all got copies of. And Carole very recently has been dealing with that period that isn't that well known. It's the period before the glory years of the Peninsular War. So it's a period of the 1790s. That's obviously involves such people as Abercrombie, etc. So this is a new area for us. She's going to talk about the very successful 1801 campaign. If you've got any questions you want me to ask Carole, please put them on chat and I'll do my very best to feel them through to Carole at the end of the talk. Carole, over to you when you're ready.
Thank you. Right, good evening. I was going to say ladies and gentlemen, I'm presuming there might be both. Right, I'm going to talk about the 1801 campaign, very much from the perspective of why it was successful when so much previously actually had failed. I've got my grandson who was just keeping an eye on things to make sure I press all the right bits. There we go.
Okay, it's actually started.
Right.
That's perfect, Carole.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you, Louis. What it is to have somebody who knows their way around technology. As I said, this is a turning point for the British Army because, let's face it, what had happened previously was not impressive. If we go back to 1792, the spring of 1792, and well, I'm sure you all recognise William Pitt amongst these three gentlemen. Pitt presenting a budget. And as you probably know, Pitt's main aim was to reduce the national debt. It governed everything he'd done up to this point. And one way, of course, to reduce your expenditure is to reduce the size of the Navy and reduce the size of the army, which is exactly what he did. It didn't end there, and I'm sure you all know what hubris is. I think this is one of the best examples. He said with complete confidence that he did not think at any time anyone could have so confidently predicted 15 years of peace. Let's run forward to February 1793, end of the month. The French have executed their king. We kick out their ambassador, the Marquis de Chauvin, and the French retaliate by declaring war on us, which was something the Girondists wanted to do anyway. This gave them their excuse. Now, the other two gentlemen, again, I'm sure most of you recognise, William Wyndham Grenville, Foreign Secretary, and Henry Dundas, the Secretary for War and the Colonies. These two men with Pitt are at the heart of the government, and they will actually determine how this war is going to be fought. The interesting thing is that Wyndham and Dundas had quite different views on where the focus should be. Grenville was very much wanting to build up coalitions within Europe, and indeed successfully did so, hence the War of the First Coalition. Dundas believed it would be more sensible to actually attack what I suppose you might call the French economic underbelly, their colonies. Excuse me. And there was actually a splitting of resources which were already run down, with an expedition going off to the West Indies and successfully taking Martinique, and Grenville's coalition waging war in the Low Countries in alliance with Austria, Prussia, Spain, Portugal. Russia was shouting from the sidelines, but really was much more interested in getting another chunk of Poland. What followed was just a notable lack of success where the European focus is concerned. The expedition to the Low Countries dragged on right through to the beginning of 1795, a dismal, disastrous retreat through the frozen wastes of Holland, finally to be carried off by the Navy. And although there was some success in the colonial sphere, it didn't really amount to very much. Yes, Martinique and St. Lucia from the French, Trinidad and Tobago from the Spanish after the Spanish had become allies of the French. The French were dispossessed from Pondicherry in India. We picked up the Cape of Good Hope while we were about it. But the one victory perhaps that might have made a difference, the most important of all the sources of foreign income for the French, Saint-Domingue, we failed. The Spanish also failed. The French failed. Everybody failed because, of course, there was a slave uprising. Now, to go back to the European theatre, this was where the main army was fighting. Now, as I've said, there'd been this drastic reduction in the number of troops. So come 1793, there's a desperate search for men. And the result was an army notable for its preponderance of very old and very young soldiers, which the wife of one of the generals described as little better than the scrapings of the gutter. Not a very promising start. They probably did better than they might have been expected to do. And admittedly, we did have a fair number of Hessians helping us out, those valuable mercenaries. But as I've said, the first campaign, the War of the First Coalition, the Low Countries, the Netherlands, that ended in defeat. The Prussians dropped out fairly early anyway. The Austrians eventually took just one defeat too many. There was a pause in the European theatre for some time. Failed attempt to get involved in the rebellion in the Vendée didn't come to anything. And then we come to the war of the Second Coalition. And once more, it's the Low Countries that we go to. This time, our allies, our closest allies, the Austrians are still there. I think that somebody once described them as the most determined of France's enemies during this period. But our closest allies were the Russians. And the plan was an invasion of Holland with the Russians as equal partners, the Duke of York in command, although in the first instance, the first forces were under the command of General Abercrombie. It wasn't any more successful. Oh, why is that not working? Oh, goodness. Sorry, I'm pressing let's try that. Ah, that's it, okay. This is the departure of the troops after they'd failed to achieve anything after the first landings at Den Helder. Yes, there were victories at Egmont and one or two other places, but the resurgence of the French, the fact that the Dutch who were showing their faces, apparently the majority simply detached themselves completely, for those Dutch who were involved very much on the French side. And once again, it ended in what can only be described as defeat. However, General Abercrombie wrote this letter to a friend, and it's an interesting one, or this is the extract of it. The men from the militia are superior to those recruited straight into the ranks of the regular army. They understand the use of arms and can move tolerably well. Their only fault is that they are not accustomed to subordination. They must be led by degrees. On no account must they be treated with too much harshness and severity. Abercrombie also wrote to Dundas, who was a very good friend of his, saying, if you treat these men properly, basically, if you put them under generals who know how to train men, if you keep them in one place so they can indulge in some concentrated training, you will have a fine army. And Dundas, I think, took that message to heart. I've mentioned the militia, and this is the big difference between the two armies of the two campaigns in the Low Countries. There had been an attempt to draw militiamen into the army in about 94, 95. Unfortunately, most men were disinclined to volunteer because they were pretty certain it would mean service in the West Indies. And everybody knew what happened if you served in the West Indies. Your chances of survival, well, were pretty low. About 50% of a battalion was likely to die of the various diseases that were endemic out there. But by 1799, the government had seen what the problem was and had assured volunteers, and it was a binding agreement, that if they came into the regular army, they would not have to serve outside Europe. And that had actually brought these men from a slightly higher social sphere, I think. Remember, they were chosen by ballot, so they were not the sweepings from the gutter, that was for sure. So here we've got this potential, and the question is, what's going to happen? Well, there were various possibilities, but the one that, as you know from the subject of the talk, finally emerged was Egypt. Just to recap very briefly, in 1798, May 1798, Napoleon had led an army, plus all the other experts he took with him, to Egypt, and enjoyed a great number of successes. I'm not going into any detail, which of course finally came to a halt at Acre in 1799. Intervention of a certain Sir Sidney Smith, who will have a part in the story I'm going to tell. Of course, there had been a serious setback because in August 1798, Nelson's victory, the Battle of the Nile or the Battle of Aboukir Bay, whichever title you want to give it, had meant that the French were essentially stranded. And from that point onwards, they were blockaded as well. And then in 1799, Napoleon received word that things were not going well in Paris, and depending on your view of him, decided to hot-foot it back to France, either to save France from itself or to forward his own power, or perhaps a combination of the two. This is Gilroy's view of it. It's rather a nice cartoon. I hope you can all see in the background the army that's being deserted jumping up and down in rage, and aboard the ship there's an awful lot of gold that those two men are clutching to themselves. Typical anti-French view, of course. Right, to move on, in 1798 Sir Charles Stuart had taken possession of the island of Minorca, and the plan was to use this as a base to support the Austrians, who at this point were struggling to hold on to those bits of Italy which they had long regarded as their own. The plan was that Stuart would take the army specifically to Genoa, but also various landings along the coast, and these would be diversionary and draw some of the French troops away. That was the idea anyway. And furthermore, there would be another diversionary attack on French soil at Belle-Île. Well, unfortunately, Charles Stuart was a very difficult man for or certainly for the Duke of York to work with. He was not prepared to accept the men that York appointed to be his senior officers, etc., etc. Stuart actually offered his resignation twice, and on the second time it was accepted. And it was at that point that General Abercrombie was given command. Abercrombie had been involved in both the Low Country campaigns. He'd been in the West Indies. He'd had a very unhappy time in Ireland as well. And he was at this point 65 years old, but since he came from a very long-lived family, that possibly was not too much of a problem. excuse me, I'm checking dates. It's the one thing I cannot do without having an aid memoir, as it were. So Abercrombie comes to Minorca. He knows what the task is, sets to sea with the troops he finds there, who were actually under the command of General Henry Fox, takes them towards Genoa, only to discover that Genoa has fallen into the hands of the French. He came back to Minorca, went off briefly to Malta, which Napoleon, of course, had grabbed on his way to Egypt, and which we were now making efforts to remove the French, approved of what was going on there, came back to Minorca and discovered, in fact, that he'd gained a sizable number of extra troops. These were the Belle-Isle troops that had failed completely under command of Lord Dalhousie. You will notice, I think, as we go through, I will be mentioning names that we perhaps tend to associate more with the Peninsular War than with anything that happened before. So the troops are on Minorca, waiting to hear where they'll go. There are various possibilities. Egypt was one, and Abercrombie knew that Dundas was very keen to get a British force into Egypt for the simple reason that Egypt could be a stepping stone to a much easier route down to the Red Sea and round to India. And that was certainly one of the things that Napoleon had in mind when he went to India. He'd even, by the way, thought it might be possible to construct a canal from the Nile to the Red Sea. That would have been the first Suez Canal, I suppose, but of course he didn't stay long enough to do that. But there were other possibilities. Abercrombie himself had suggested, and it was a result of what he's observed at Trinidad, that the Spanish possession of some parts of South America was just rotten, and it wouldn't be difficult to stir up some resistance to them, which would be useful distraction from the Spanish helping the French. And another possibility was another visit to the West Indies. Well, before any sort of decision was made, and I'm going to deal very briefly with the attempt to attack Cadiz, because it's important for what subsequently happened. With Admiral Keith in command of the Mediterranean fleet, the troops from Minorca were taken to Cadiz at the same time. Lord Pulteney brought down some troops from Lisbon, and the combined force was designed to attack Spain at a point where it was thought Spain was vulnerable. The problem was that Keith himself appeared not to be familiar with the winds and tides of this particular area. And Abercrombie couldn't get him to commit himself to a promise that if the troops were taken and landed, the Navy would be able to bring them back. Now, this was very typical of Keith, because although this was a combined operation, or as they would have called it at that time, a conjunct operation, Keith seems quite determined, as he had been on other occasions, that if it went wrong, he was not going to take the blame. And in the end, because Abercrombie couldn't get that assurance from him, the whole thing was aborted and the whole lot went back to Gibraltar. And it was in Gibraltar that they finally found out that it was going to be Egypt. I just bring these two men up because they're going to play a notable part. Abercrombie had already decided, and at this point, the army was in two divisions, that these were the two men he would depend upon. General John Healy Hutchinson, a long-standing friend, and who was actually his second in command, and General John Moore, of course, who had first met Abercrombie in the West Indies, had been with him at Den Helder, and indeed had been very supportive of him in Ireland as well, a man that he trusted absolutely. Now, the plan was then that this army, sitting around with not much to do at this point, would go to Egypt. They would among other things, give passage to the Turkish army and work in concert with the Turks. Now, one thing that Abercrombie had learnt, of course, is that it can be very difficult to work with troops who are, in all senses, very alien from your own. That had been one of the problems in Holland, that the Russian were doing things. So the decision was taken that yes, the presence of the Turks would be valuable, but the two forces would work quite independently, supporting each other, but not working together. It was also planned there should be a second attack from the Red Sea, and these would be troops that would be brought from India. Assuming victory, the French would be transported home. But if Abercrombie wanted to act in any way differently from the way that Dundas was telling him, he was free to do so. I think one thing to note about this campaign, quite different from the other two European campaigns, was it observed one of the principles of, or one of the main principles of war, to identify and maintain an achievable objective. It was an achievable objective to remove the French from Egypt. That was the beginning and the end of it. Well, Abercrombie immediately got into action. He sent a message to Lord Elgin, who was a British representative of Constantinople, to procure horses and mules. He sent his quartermaster general, Anstruther, to Rhodes to find supplies. And he sent the deputy quartermaster general, a certain George Murray, to Jaffa, not only to make contact with the Turks, but to try and judge the quality of the troops that they would be bringing into action. Now, at this point, the French are very much concentrated in the area of Alexandria, with support forts at places like Rosetta, in Cairo, and then the map doesn't go quite far enough, but down on the Red Sea, there's the Red Sea ports are just off the map. Those three areas were their hold on Egypt, and it was a pretty secure hold. There wasn't much danger that they were going to be kicked out in the short term. However, there was plenty to suggest that this was a demoralized army. For example, an intercepted letter from a French officer wrote that Egypt is a land of desolation and horror, and we have reason to curse the day that witnessed our landing in this miserable country. The man who'd been left in command of the Army of the Orient, which was the title that the French gave to that particular army, was General Kleber. But unfortunately, he was murdered by a Muslim fanatic, and his place was taken by General Menou. Now, it's generally agreed that Menou was a very good administrator. It's also generally agreed that, unfortunately, he was not a good field commander. He'd actually converted to Islam. He wasn't the only one of the French officers that did that. He'd taken the name Abdullah, and he'd married an Egyptian wife. One of his problems was that he was totally contemptuous of the British Army, probably with good reason. When you look at the achievement so far, there really wasn't much to celebrate. But of course, that's a rather dangerous view to take. To return to Abercrombie and his troops then, on the 5th of November, they set sail for Malta. By this time, the French had already surrendered the island. Abercrombie himself arrived on the 19th. And realized he needed information. He called in George Baldwin, who was checking his title, Consul General in Egypt, and in fact had had dealings with the Turks for about 3 decades, so ought to have been a very reliable informant, proved not to be quite as reliable, but he did serve a useful purpose. He was also very concerned that the troops were stuck in the transports, and therefore he organized a kind of rotating system by which troops got on land, and he went to great lengths to get fresh supplies for them. In fact, most of the troops that wrote journals, and a fair number of them did, comment on not just how good the food was in Malta, but also how cheap it was. On the 20th of December, the fleet left Malta, but didn't sail direct for Egypt. One thing, they weren't ready. Instead, they went to Marmaris Bay. And this is where perhaps the most important groundwork was done for the campaign. For one thing, there was time. Time was on their side. It was no good going to Egypt until supplies were in, until Murray had returned with information about the Turks, which when it came was not encouraging, it might be added, when fresh food was available. But most importantly, the one thing that Abercrombie was determined wasn't going to happen was a repeat of the landings at Den Helder in 1799. From the British point of view, the good fortune was that only a weak Dutch force was waiting for them, because Moore's Journal brings this out very well. As the naval boats brought the troops in, they just deposited them anywhere, and Moore and the other generals wasted a fair amount of time trying to find where their various troops were. Moore said his were from one end of the beach to the other. That was the one thing that Abercrombie was not going to let happen. And the result was practice after practice after practice, until when it came to the landings in Egypt, every man, military and naval, would know exactly what he'd got to do. There was one other precaution as well. Abercrombie decided, as a result of Cadiz, that General Keith would be pushed to one side. And instead, the two men who organized the practice for the landings were Captain Alexander Cochrane, the uncle of the more famous Cochrane, and the Quartermaster General Anstruther. Not only that, but obviously, again, the men are in transport. Once more, Abercrombie had temporary accommodation, that was rotated, but also men were sent ashore to exercise. He was determined to keep them as fit as he could. And he also kept them busy, not only gabions and fascines, but they were actually spent time making mallets and tent pegs and anything that would usefully keep them distracted. Right, sorry, look at a day scale. Oh, and there was one useful addition. Sir Sidney Smith turned out. Now, he had the advantage of knowing the Egyptian coast. He was a bit of a maverick, I think it's fair to say, but he proved a very useful addition, as we shall see. Right, eventually then, they were able to sail. On the 23rd of February, the fleet left Aboukir Bay and sailed to Alexandria. You can see Aboukir Bay. I haven't got a little pointer, I wish I had, but if you can see Aboukir and the black blob, the bay is at the northern end of that blob. And you can see it's a wooded area behind, but I'll talk in more detail about it in a minute. Now, as I said, the French are divided in between the Red Sea ports, Cairo and Alexandria. The commander at Alexandria was General Louis Friant, another man who again had a very low opinion of the British and even doubted whether they were going to come to Alexandria, whether there would even be any landings. Well, he was disabused about that when the ships actually anchored on the 2nd of March. They had some pretty rough weather, which is why it took them so long. And these were naval warships, but well out. Aboukir Bay is a very shallow bay, and the warships were about 9 miles out, but nonetheless, Friant could see. Now, he sent messages to Menou, who was in Cairo. Menou believed that this was merely a diversion and that the main force would come much further west along the coast. Sorry, east along the coast. I'm doing it in the wrong direction. That was an illusion. He did send off some troops under General Lanous, and then changed his mind and called most of them back. So Friant had about 2,000 troops, an equal number to that of invalids and naval personnel, plus a small number of Lanous's troops that joined him. However, he was quite confident that that was enough to hold off any landing. His theory was, and I suppose Den Helder in a way had proved it, that landings tended to be pretty chaotic. And if you attacked in those early stages when the first men were landing, you would cause such confusion that in the end, the invaders would be driven off and would have to accept that they'd been defeated. Right. One of the things that Abercrombie did was to go with Moore as close inshore as he could, to take a good look at Aboukir Bay. In this image, you can quite clearly see the castle, which had about a dozen 28-pounder guns, a fair number of 12-pounders, and indeed some lighter guns as well. There was a blockhouse at the other end of the bay, and that was known to have at least one heavy gun. And then you can see in the middle the sand hills, which were useful, of course, for the defending army to conceal their true strength. And of course, they would also have guns. And in actual fact, the gunpowder of the French could enfilade something like 1,800 yards, which is one end of the bay to the other. There was some delay because, again, the weather was particularly difficult. But on the 8th of March, I should say the naval boats had moved in closer on the 7th of March. On the 8th of March, the landings actually took place. And this picture, I think, gives some idea of how it was done. 3 lines of boats, strictly speaking, there were 4. Now, the one nearest the shore, I'm going to repeat the numbers because I have no memory for numbers, 58 flat boats, each one with 50 soldiers in it. In the second line, there were 84 cutters, and they were full of troops who would make the second line. The third line was 37 launches, and in the fourth line, there were 14 launches with 500 sailors, the gunners, and 14 field guns. Now, the problem that Abercrombie had recognized from what he knew of Aboukir was because it was shallow, it would be very difficult for the sailors to row the boats ashore, deposit the first line, then row all the way back to pick up the next lot of troops. And that's what the rehearsals had been all about. This rather foreshortened picture obviously makes the boats look closer. But in fact, the first line was halfway between the shore and the second line, and the second line was some way well clear of the naval boats. Right, so the timetable. At 3 o'clock in the morning, there was a rocket signal. By 3:30, the boats were rowing into position, and by 8 o'clock, the assembly was complete. All the boats were in the right place. At 9 o'clock, the signal to row ashore was given and greeted by 3 loud cheers. Obviously, there was heavy fire from the shore, from the defending French troops, from the castle, from the blockhouse, and there were indeed casualties. This is the Coldstream Guards, some of the Coldstream Guards getting a direct hit. However, the first troops landed. They landed exactly as they should do, in order of battle, and it was General Moore who led the reserve, which was his command, up the highest of the Sandhills. At this time, though, Friant released his cavalry. The idea was that the cavalry would come galloping down and the troops would be thrown in confusion. But in a sense, I think he'd lost the moment, because the troops, more and more of them landing, beat off the cavalry and began to climb the sandhills. And then, in what must have seemed like no time at all, the second line were well on the way to the shore, and Friant had no choice but to actually withdraw. In other words, this was a perfectly planned landing which went exactly as had been hoped, and landed Abercrombie's force, about 15,000 strong, safely in Egypt. The French, by the way, doubtful exactly what their numbers were, but it seems to be about 25,000. But remember, some were in Cairo and some were about to be pulled in from the Red Sea ports. Now, I'm keeping an eye on the clock, and it's going to be a little bit of a whistle-stop tour from this point onwards. Initially, the problem was to find water, but when the reserve was sent forward on the 9th of March, it actually found water near Mandora, one of the places between Abukir and Alexandria. Between the 10th and the 11th, when the weather calmed down, stores began to be landed. And on the same day, Arabs began to come in. Remember, Arabs were very much subservient to the Turks, and they clearly saw the British as somebody to welcome. They were bringing in so much fresh food that George Baldwin, who of course was fluent in the language, set up a market. This was a strictly controlled market. This is typical of the campaign. There was a price list. It had opening hours, and there were very, very strict punishments for anybody who tried to defraud the Arabs. And indeed, it worked very well. The advance continued, the guns were landed. I should have said that one thing Sidney Smith had done was to destroy a pontoon bridge that linked Abukir to Alexandria. It's the one the French had used, so that obviously spoiled their plans. I apologise that the map is upside down. It was taken from Thomas Walsh's account of the campaign. But as you can see, we've got the British advancing and the French holding a position. We turn the map round in front of Alexandria. The French attacked first. It was, in fact, quite a bloody affair, heavier British cavalry's casualties, I should say, than French, but eventually, as you can see, the French have, in fact, I think the French are off the map. In my account, they're behind all the list of names I can see. But if you can imagine, they've been pushed considerably back. And in fact, the British are now in the position that the French had been at the start. And of course, they can see ahead of them the fortifications guarding Alexandria. Right. Yes, I'm just checking the map to make sure it is what I think it is. The advance continued. By this time, Menou had come up with from Cairo, brought a fair number of reinforcements with him, and Abercrombie rather suspected that Menou would come straight into action. He therefore, on the 20th, gave the order that every night soldiers were to sleep with their accoutrements on and with their weapons to hand. And it was just as well he did, because on the 21st, the French did indeed attack. And it was a very hard fought battle. Of course, one of the most notable things about it is when the 28th let the French cavalry charge through their ranks and then calmly turned around and took them out on the return journey, hence the double badge. A French soldier, a French officer actually, commented afterwards, the English had set up impenetrable defences through which it was impossible to break. Many attacks were made, all were futile. Every trick of war was tried, every effort made, but retreat was inevitable with great loss on both sides. About 1,500 on the British side, 4,000 approximately, judging from the number that were left behind on the French side. However, worse than that was what happened to Abercrombie. Now, this is called the death of Abercrombie. In actual fact, at this point, he'd been attacked, as you can see, by a French cavalryman, and the Highlander in the picture had actually intervened. Abercrombie got a deep slash, but no more than that. What nobody knew until after the battle was that he'd actually taken a musket in his thigh close up to the hip joint. And it was only when the battle was over, it was realized that the wound was serious. He was carried to the shore. Notable that soldiers were running up, particularly the Irish, with whom he had a very good understanding, blessing him and wishing him luck and all the rest of it. He was taken out to Keith's flagship, the Foudroyant, where he died 6 days later of sepsis. That meant that John Healy Hutchinson was now in command. He had the choice of either continuing the attack against Alexandria or taking Cairo. And since he was so close to Abercrombie, the fact that he actually decided to take the bulk of the army down to Cairo would suggest that that is what he thought Abercrombie himself would have wanted. And this is just a picture of Rosetta, which was one of the places that was quickly taken. Right, it's the map, that's what I want. So he left a small force under General Ercout to blockade Alexandria and brought his troops down. And this is one of my husband's maps, which is something I couldn't do. And as you can see, it's from point to point. It took, check the dates again, and they started on the 5th of May, and they will finally reach, Giza anyway, by the 27th of June. And here we go, down they go. Before they got to, in fact, it was between Shrubrakit and Algam, there was an action. There'd also be an action at Aramania, but every time, although the French were definitely giving good account of themselves, remember this is Napoleon's beloved Egyptians. These are the men who'd been with him at Lodi and Arcola and Rivoli. They were his veteran troops from that first Italian campaign. You'll see all these nice arrows, which actually is the route that Healy Hutchinson took down to Cairo. We've got them down to Giza, and I think I did say the date. In Cairo, we have General Belliard in command, and of course, when he's summoned to surrender, he initially refuses. I think he might have been persuaded when he realized that he didn't only have a British force to contend with, but there was actually a Turkish force. The Turks had arrived a couple of days after Alexandria, and they had been following the British army down the Nile. It's quite interesting, actually, that when the British troops had these various encounters with the French, as soon as they were sure of victory, they then went and sort of scooped the French up because they were so sickened by the Turkish habit of cutting French heads off. They obviously thought that that was not the way you behaved after a fight. So here we have General Belliard, who on the 27th of June decides to surrender. The French troops are escorted back by some of Hutchinson's force to Cairo. Just a picture. This is actually, again, one of Walsh's. All the journals comment on seeing the pyramids for the first time. And there we have that Giza itself, where the British troops settled. Right, meanwhile, we've got the troops coming up from India. Now, this is interesting because they consisted of 1,000 European troops, British battalions, and 2,000 sepoys. And this was the first time that native Indian troops had been used in a campaign outside India. In command was General Baird. The man who should have been in second in command was a certain Arthur Wellesley, but he fell sick, so he didn't take part in it. Been interesting to see how Wellesley and Baird would have got on. Baird was not, again, one of the easiest people to deal with. They had sailed from India and via Jeddah come to the Red Sea, coming to the port of Qasr. If they were to reach Cairo, they would have to cross what was just a desolate area of desert to Kenna and then up the Nile to Cairo. And Baird was as well prepared as Abercrombie had been. He was aware that this would be a difficult advance. So he sent his troops out in small parties, and each detachment had extra supplies which they left in place for the following troops, and that went right through to Kenna. And there from Kenna they went up to Cairo. Unfortunately, they got within reach of Cairo a little bit too late to take part in what was happening there. However, Hutchinson told Baird to keep going. He, meanwhile, had taken his troops back to Alexandria. Here we are, that same view. Hutchinson reached Alexandria early in August and offered Menu the chance to surrender. Menu had no intention of surrendering. I think he still perhaps couldn't quite believe what the British troops had managed to do so far. So on the 16th of August, Hutchinson sent General Aircoupe with half the force to a point about 10 miles west of Alexandria. And that was intended to be the main attack on the city. But at the same time, Hutchinson attacked the defences from the east to keep Menu guessing. Coote was successful. He took the fort of Marabut. He got very close, drove the French outposts back into Alexandria, and everything was ready for an attack. When the guns opened fire, it does seem to have concentrated Menu's mind, rather, and he sent in a flag of truce. Even then, though, he prevaricated, he dragging up conditions that obviously the British were not going to accept. And eventually, on the 2nd of September, Menu had to accept the inevitable and finally surrendered. Once again, poor old Baird and his force actually got to Rosetta, which is pretty close to Alexandria, on the 31st of August. But they were, you'll be pleased to know, still given a share of the prize money. That, after all, it was quite an advance that Baird had undertaken. So there we have the end of the, I would mention, by the way, because I hadn't discovered this until I was working on my book on Egypt, that the remains of General Kleber, who was much admired by his troops, had actually been embalmed. And when the Cairo troops advanced up the Nile, under escort, of course, his remains lay in a black draped barge to be taken back to France and given appropriate burial. Now, I've tried to suggest that this was a campaign where careful planning, concern for the welfare of the troops, which was certainly one of the things that determined everything that Abercrombie did, even the well-disciplined behavior of the troops, which I think was largely due to the fact that Egypt is a Muslim country and alcohol was difficult to come by. That might be unfair to them, but it probably would seem to be a factor anyway. The ability of generals in command to appreciate the big picture and realize what was best to do. Well, one could go on indefinitely, but there was one other thing which I think is worth mentioning. And it's indicative of Abercrombie's concern for his troops, and that was the provision for the health of the soldiers. Now, the medical board in London had wanted to appoint Dr. James Frank as the chief medical officer. He was on Minorca already, so it was obvious. But Abercrombie seems to have decided, I don't think he had anything personal against Frank. He wanted Dr. Thomas Young, with whom he'd worked in the West Indies and who was a man who he felt understood the needs of the soldiers. And Abercrombie's influence meant that it was Young who took charge and very efficiently dealt with the problems that they were going to face. And one of them, of course, was bubonic plague, which was endemic in Egypt. Obviously, special hospitals were set up, strict quarantine was observed. The area around the hospitals was heavily guarded, so nobody could just wander in. And as you can see, these are figures for Abu Qir and Rosetta, that the survival rate for a disease that British doctors were not used to dealing with is not at all bad. There was another problem, one that wasn't anticipated. Oh, these are, by the way, sorry, I should have shown you the bulbas that you get, courtesy of Mick Cromplin, I might add, as are these rather unpleasant pictures. Ophthalmia. Now, they thought it was caused by heat and dust, but it wasn't. It was a contagious bacterium, chlamydia, highly contagious, in fact. And it actually became endemic in the British Army. It's amazing how many discharge papers, if you work your way through, cite this and the recurrent, the subsequent blindness that could lead to a man having to be discharged. There's one further step as well. The British Army had been trying to persuade colonels to vaccinate their troops against smallpox. It was done in a very ad hoc way. Some colonels were reluctant to do it, but it was decided that this would be good protection for the British Army in Egypt, where it was feared that there might be a smallpox outbreak. 2 civilian doctors were sent out. They arrived in August 1801, I should say, and they vaccinated, as far as we know, everybody that they could get their hands on. And they even had vaccine to spare, which they took to the Turks and started vaccinating the Turks as well. The other thing that the medical board, which doesn't usually get a very good press, picked up quite early on, that more medical personnel were needed than had been expected for this expedition, so they obliged and sent more personnel out. I'll just use this picture because those eyes are not particularly pleasant to look at. The sad thing was that by the time the army of Egypt returned to Britain, peace negotiations were well advanced. There'd been the first suggestions of peace actually before the expedition set out. And indeed, one of the ways that Dundas had persuaded Pitt to agree to an attack on Egypt was to suggest that our possession of Egypt would be a useful trump card. So when the troops finally arrived back, their success was rather glossed over by the excitement of peace after 8 years of war. But those who'd taken part certainly felt they'd done something special. These were the thoughts of Thomas Walsh, who'd been aide-de-camp to General Eyre Coope, and who published his account, a detailed account of the campaign in 1803, and wrote, "An enemy who during the war had considered himself as invincible was taught by this campaign that British troops meeting him on fair ground will ever maintain a fair superiority. From it, we hope will result some advantage of our country, and we trust that it will not be forgotten either by our enemies or by our friends." Well, the Turks were very generous. Every officer was awarded this medal. I have one actually, was awarded to the paymaster of the 30th, which is not quite as good quality as this. I suspect senior officers got a slightly superior version. And although perhaps the campaign in Egypt was forgotten as the successes of the Peninsular War took place, it's quite interesting to consider how many men who were in Egypt were also in the peninsula. I hope as I've been going through, you've picked up a lot of names. I can add a few more. James Kempt, who was Abercrombie's secretary, Rowland Hill, John Hope, Edward Paget, Lowry Cole, John Coburn, Robert Wilson. One could go on add quite a few more. Most of them perhaps at lieutenant colonel rank at this point, some not even as high as that. Brent Spencer was another one, yes, I didn't actually mention him. And interestingly, in the 1847 General Service Medal lists, 1,100 bars were awarded for Egypt. About 50% of those men also got bars for the peninsula. And if we consider that from 1801 to 1847, an awful lot, and probably the majority of the Egypt veterans had died, I think we can assume that those regiments, those battalions which had been in Egypt, took to the peninsula a hard core of experienced soldiers, and soldiers who had served under a general who not only expected discipline, expected his troops to be well trained, but had cared for them and led them to victory. And excuse a little bit of self-promotion, but if you are interested in the Egypt campaign, there's a lot more information in this than I've been able to give tonight. Thank you.
Carole, that was absolutely wonderful. That was such an insightful covering of a campaign that we know so little about, because in a way it is totally forgotten, isn't it, for the reasons you mentioned?
Yeah, it's so sad because it really is the turning point. You know, the British Army never looked back after that, and it just pulled everything together, I think, that had been learned in those previous 8 years and put it into good practice.
Listen, I've got a few questions, but more importantly, so have people. So first of all, that was absolutely excellent. And thank you so much for bearing with that slight technical glitch we had. And that, of course, folks, is the reason why we say, you know, don't put your video on, because the whole thing is so precarious and you witness the problem of bandwidth.
I have visions, John, of having to run upstairs and get Louis down and
Well, we didn't need to call on Louis. Louis has been fantastic because, of course, we do have a backup, and I'd already got Carole's slides. If the worst was the worst, Carole would have gone, next slide, John, and I think we'd have got through it. But well done for holding on to that. Let me deal with some questions, if I may, please. Right, let me just call them up here. Right, I've got a question. I think this was from Clive Hammersley, and saying, I thought the militia could only be used within the British Isles. Neil's pointed out, not if individuals were persuaded. And of course, militia is seen as a training ground. If you can get them, why don't you join the British Army?
Well, I can take that a bit further. It was at that period service in Europe. No doubt about that. I know it did later become just in the British Army. And of course, Egypt is outside Europe. And Abercrombie did actually have some battalions with quite a heavy militia present. One or two he left on Malta and picked up, and I have to say it, he picked up the 30th Foot and the 89th, who had been the two. He actually reviewed the 30th and gave them an excellent testimonial, I suppose you might call it. Yeah, they did quite well actually out there, to be fair. But some battalions, the men in the militia, immediately volunteered to serve outside Europe. And the most notable was the 2 battalions of the 40th Foot. So many volunteered. Abercrombie decided he couldn't take the whole lot, but he took the 4 flank companies. And they did it again very well in Egypt. But they, you know, the men just jump forward, give us a chance, you want to get at the French. Perhaps they felt by that point that they'd got a very good chance of teaching the French a lesson.
Which they did. I've got a question from Clive Hammersley on Baird's troops coming in. The troops from India, were they British Army or sepoy or mixture?
There were 1,000 British Army, described as European troops, and there were 2,000 sepoys.
Brilliant. You see, Clive, you just had the information like that. Here's one from Marcus Beresford. It's about Healy Hutchinson.
Yes.
Given his success in securing French defeat in Egypt, why did he not command again other than at home?
You know, I really don't know. He had a tough time of it. Obviously, time was of the essence, and the actual covering of the campaign was just a brief digest of it. People sort of knew and trusted Abercrombie. He was a man who was very accessible. He actually made a point of making himself accessible at set times to anybody from top to bottom who had any concern. Healy Hutchinson was totally different. He was a very, not a sociable man. He also wasn't an imposing looking man. And when he announced he was going to take the army to Cairo, there was a lot of resistance from senior officers. And they had hoped that Moore could be persuaded to become, you know, to replace Hutchinson and do something more sensible. Unfortunately, Moore had been wounded at Alexandria. And to be fair, I do not think he would have agreed, because he knew Abercrombie had appointed Hutchinson, and Hutchinson did very well. But for the first part of that advance on Cairo, he was dealing with something very close to an officer's mutiny. And it was only when they kept going, and, you know, no French, and, you know, it's not very pleasant. It went as high as 49 degrees, and then they had the hands in to deal with. So, you know, the wind was, well, they had several days when they had to stop advancing because the wind was so bad. Yes, he got them there and got them back again. And you can't ask for much more than that.
You can't. Adrian has mentioned about Wellington and Baird. Jerry about North Gloucestershire's fighting back to back, and the regiments wearing the back cap badge. Oh yes, were Ottoman troops ever used to engage the French during this campaign?
They chose to engage the French only during the advance on Cairo. It was a matter of the French, mainly cavalry, would be out, and whoever fell on them, it might be the British, it might be the Turks. They were up, for one thing, on the opposite sides of the river, so that which made it absolutely clear they were working independently. But no, they weren't involved in any what we'd call pitched battle. They didn't arrive until after Alexandria, and that really was the last pitched battle.
Thank you. David Maloney's asked a question about journals. Are there any memoirs or recollections to compare with the accounts in the Peninsula and Waterloo?
Yes, there are. And in fact, if I shouldn't have taken it out, I actually had a whole page, but I can give you some names for anybody who's interested. I won't go through the whole list, but I will pick some out because there are plenty. And not just soldiers. George Baldwin, the consul, wrote an account. You've got Major Francis Moore, he was with the 2nd. A French one is Joseph Marie Moiret, which is easily obtainable. Also, John Moore's journals and letters, Daniel Nicol, David Robinson. These are all familiar, I think, people. Perhaps the one that pulls everything together is Thomas Walsh's. There's Robert Wilson, Samuel Ray. I don't know who he's got. Perhaps they're born in John Coburn. Keith's papers. Yeah, there's that's probably just scraping the surface there. It's surprising.
David, of course, is to buy Carole's book, and you can get all that information there. So that's cool. What have I got? Andrew Dismore, Sultan's Medal for Egypt was for most officers plain gold, no diamonds, and it came in 2 sizes depending on the recipient's rank. Josephine Oxley, fascinating. Thank you, Carole. Andy, thank you very much. Fascinating. Very interesting. Thanks, Carole, from Martin Davis. Same from Clive Hammersley, and from Moira as well. Andrew Dismore, what happened to the French prisoners? Were they repatriated given the Treaty of Amiens? And if so, no grief like after the Convention of Sintra?
No, not at all. But that had been agreed from the beginning, that we were not going to sort of put them all to the sword or anything like that. I'm sure the Turks would have done, given the chance. They were going to be brought back to France. That was the undertaking. The Navy would bring them back to France. Now, I didn't get the chance to really give as much credit to the Navy as I should have done. As I say, Keith was a difficult man, but I think he quickly grasped that this campaign was going to be successful. And therefore, you know, the naval resources were there. It was sailors that were pulling the guns as they advanced towards Alexandria. There was sailors on boats down the Nile, taking the men's backpacks and all the rest of it. So it was very much a genuinely conjunct operation.
Absolutely great, thank you. There's more and more thank yous coming in. Martin Davis, are there any known memorials or museums that cover this early campaign in Egypt? Not
as far as I know, no.
Forgotten campaign, isn't it, really?
Yes, it really is. Forgotten men, forgotten general. I mean, that's the other thing, you know, that Abercrombie was no mean general, particularly in building up a good army. I think he probably was fast in his own lifetime.
I've been asked what happened to his body, Carole.
He's buried in Malta. I've actually been to and paid my respects, having, you know, written a book about him. I thought I ought to. A man, I have to say, I much admire.
Remember, Carole has written a definitive book on Abercrombie, folks, so buy that one as well. I've got a question. The Thomas Walsh you mentioned for the journals, etc. Is this the Thomas Walsh who was previously in the Irish Brigade in the French service and came into British service? Now, that's in Marcus Beresford.
I don't think so. I wouldn't swear to it, but I don't think so.
Right. I'm good. I'm going to save your modesty, Carole, on the basis everybody's seeing how brilliant this talk was. So let me keep moving through on this one, if I may. Yes, thanks for an excellent talk. Thanks for a very interesting presentation. It just says it all. Carole, thank you so much. That was absolutely wonderful. And folks, buy Carole's book.
Thank you all very much. It's quite daunting, actually, I have to say, giving a talk where you can't see the audience, but it was a pleasure. It feels good now I've finished anyway. That sounds terrible, but you know what I mean.
We've all been there, don't we?
Yeah.
Absolutely. Folks, I'm just going to do some parish notices, if I may. That was the 9th lecture in the series, and basically that was going to be the last one, because as you know, the cunning plan was that in a couple of weeks we'd be at Higham, and then everything else would be back to normal, and of course it isn't. So you'll notice, please, that our AGM is on the 6th of April, so that's a Tuesday, 6:30. It looks like it's going to be one of the most popular AGMs we've ever run, and I can only think that that is the case from the Eventbrite bookings, because Gareth is going to be talking on his latest book, Marching, Fighting and Dying in the Peninsula. So what I am saying is the tickets, I know we've only had them out for about a week or so, but places are going rapidly, so please do book those. At the AGM, I will be talking about 2 more talks that we will do in this series that will be in May. So the series does continue to bridge the gap. So, but I will be talking about that when we do the AGM in April. If you go onto our website, there will be, you'll see there that we've put a PDF, we're very grateful to Nick Lipscomb for this, a report on the Woolwich Rotunda, which I'm sure you'll find of interesting there. On our website, on the members zone, there's 5 podcasts, there's 5 videos. Very grateful to Alan and to Owen, who are converting the last 2 talks, and we'll have Carole's talk to convert as well and top and tail it. So there will be another 3 videos appearing on there very, very shortly. The international trip, which was due to happen at the end of May, well, obviously it won't be happening at the end of May, but we have managed to revamp that, and we will be running that the first week of October. This is the invasion of France, you may remember, so we will be dealing with things such as what happens to the British Army after the 18th of June, but it brings into account also the Duke of Marlborough's Battle of Malplaquet. It deals also with the 1643 Battle of Rocroi. Because we've moved it to October, there are places available. So if any of you are thinking, well, I want to do something in October, now, Maitland, now's your time, as they say. So please drop me an email. And I think that's it, except on behalf of us all, to thank Carole for such a wonderful lecture this evening, and to say, look forward to seeing you all very, very much at the AGM on the 6th of April. Thank you very much indeed. Stay safe. Bye for now.